Commercial airplane pilots, what's the closest disaster you've averted while on a flight that the passengers had no idea about? How often do these things happen? Half the passengers in this story had no idea, while the other half likely crapped themselves. My father was a captain for Eastern Airlines and told a story about almost being at takeoff speed when another commercial jet taxied across his runway. He was going too fast to abort, so he had to pull up early and cleared the other plane by feet. Don't remember the exact amount. His passengers had no idea, but the other plane's passengers saw everything. I don't know what ended up happening to the other pilot, but my dad got an apology call from him that evening. Yay. Story time. I'm an air traffic controller. For the record. Had a pilot go Nordo, that's when. For whatever reason, they aren't on my frequency anymore. They didn't get the right one. Misheard. Or their radios crapped out. It happens fairly often. And there are a number of things we can do to get you back in the right place. This particular guy, however, went Nordo at precisely the worst time. He was going eastbound, which means he was at an odd altitude. He lost his radio, and his flight plan then had him turn southbound. That means he was supposed to be at an even altitude, which he obviously wasn't. There were about a dozen different planes going northbound that were at his altitude. So he ended up running one heck of a gauntlet through all these people as I was descending and climbing them to get them out of his way. Then, apparently in an act of sheer ignorance on the pilot's part, he decided to choose an even altitude all by himself, knowing he should probably be at one. Remember all those planes I had to move out of his way? He managed to put himself right back into them. When you have closure rates of over 1,000 knots an hour, that's not a lot of time to react to those things. At the end, my asshole was clenched so tight that when I stood up, the seat came with me. Edit, guys. For the love of God. I've answered it 7 times now if you'll just read before posting. I freaking know it's just knots. Not knots per hour. Not everyone is familiar with the lingo, so I said it that way to make it easier. Give it a rest. Currently a flight instructor. Had a near miss a month ago. I was in a practice area with a student pilot who was performing steep turns. Our standard procedure is for both pilots to look in the direction of the turn and state clearly clear right left before even dipping a wing. Well, it had been a long day and I was getting pretty tired. As the student pilot prepared to start his turn, I casually glanced to the right and said clear to the rig. Holy crap, never mind my flight controls. A Cessna Caravan from a nearby charter company was passing within 100 feet of our right wing and the turn would have taken us directly into him. My student never even saw him. In any case, it shook me up pretty good and taught me an important lesson about not getting lazy with clearing procedures even after a long tiring day. Fortunately, I still looked. And so the clearing procedure essentially worked as it should have by keeping separation. But I shouldn't have even begun saying the phrase clear right until I had carefully examined the air next to us. Little things like that can help you in this industry. Regional airline pilot here. ATC. Pilots. Mechanics. And everyone else that works around planes make mistakes multiple times a day. But there is something to be said about making so many mistakes you become a smoking hole in the ground. That is ridiculous hard to do. There is so much redundancy and layers of safety built in the airline environment. The last carrier crash with fatalities was with Colgan Air back in 2009. There have been millions and millions of flights since then. Try to wrap your mind around how amazing that is. And it's not luck. It's the system we fly under. So we're like in the golden age of flying? With the exception of the Tsar. In terms of safety. Absolutely. Comfort. Not so much. As a frequent flyer, I hope no actual pilots reply to this. Finally, my time to shine. My father is a commercial pilot and has been for decades. Used to be a 747-400 co-captain. Then a 757 captain. Not really sure what he flies these days. Anyway, a couple years ago he was very upset at exactly what this post is asking. He was in Brazil. or Buenos Aires, or some such place, South America, and on takeoff, the tire blew. It ripped a giant hole right through the wing of the plane. He had to dump thousands of gallons of fuel and managed to land the plane. The write-up that made the news was something like, "A plane had to do an emergency landing after an event today. No one was hurt." However, all the mechanics and people involved said they absolutely couldn't believe he managed to land that plane in the condition it was in. They claimed he should have crashed and couldn't believe it. He was very angry that they didn't tell the passengers and didn't want to fly again for a couple months. He was very shaken. He even sent the pictures to me of the damage and said I should leak them somewhere. But the fact is, no one cares. I managed to find them in the old email. So, here you go. Airline pilot, hence the throwaway account. I had a couple. My most recent one was in a holding pattern and was I listening ATC cleaning another plane to land on the same runway in the opposite direction that another plane was taking off. Immediately went on the radio and informed the other planes about the conflict. The plane taking off aborted the takeoff and the landing plane aborted the landing. Very quickly another ATC took over from the one that goofed. How dirty was the plane that ATC had to clean it before it landed? Stupid autocorrect on my phone. But on second thought, the mental image of a ATC washing a plane on the runway is way too funny to correct, so I will leave it. Not a pilot, but I was on a plane that had a near miss. We were flying to Chicago and about to land. Right when the landing gear would normally pop out, the plane shoots straight back up in the air. I looked at the flight attendants, as they know what's normal and what's not. They looked scared shitless. I honestly thought it was a terrorist attack. We got back up to altitude and the pilot came over the intercom. He told us to stay buckled and it would be just a few more minutes. Still freaking out at this point. But in a little bit we actually did make a safe landing. Turns out, two planes were attempting to land at the same time and on the same runway. Very scary, but everyone was okay. Regional airline pilot. I fly the CRJ series of jets. In 3 years I have not had a single life-threatening event or close call. Airline flying is beyond mundane and safe. My friend was a co-pilot on a commercial flight I was on from Toronto to Los Angeles, and it was the scariest flight I have been on, and getting the co-pilot's perspective after the flight made it even scarier. The flight went very smoothly until we were making the descent into Los Angeles Airport, LAX, just after 10 PM. I was looking out the window and it seemed as if we were 20 meters from touching the runway when all the lights began to flicker and the plane went into complete darkness. Immediately, you could feel and hear the engines thunder into overdrive and we pulled back up. Plane continued rising and we began to circle the air in complete darkness as everyone begins to share concerns. The flight kept circling for about 20 minutes before the pilot came on explaining they were having some technical problems. And they are discussing with the ATC to resolve the issue and make a safe landing. The circling in the air continued for nearly an hour, but it seemed like an eternity in pitch black. Lights never came on. And we were notified we were going to make an attempt to land. People say this all the time, but I can assure you, this was one scary descent. The bumpiest descent I have ever been part of. We were constantly being lifted from our seats. The seatbelt light really had merit this time. People were screaming each time and I was actually holding on to the armrests and we kept defying gravity and swaying left and right. When we saw the lights on the runway inch closer, the plane slammed onto the runway and we once again heard the engines roaring as we slowed down on the runway. As we came to a stop, the plane just stayed there and waited on the runway for a tow to the docking area. You could feel the relief within the cabin. If everyone was sitting on toilets, I can assure you, each one would need a flush. After we arrived, I met with the co-pilot a few hours later, as we had planned to meet for a day before he had to fly out of town. He explained they lost electrical power and had lost several forms of communication and flight information was not available to the pilots. Ultimately, the pilots had to land the plane manually with nearly no assistance or outside help. Considering it was nighttime, poor visibility and limited flight information available, This made for a very shitty landing. He admitted as well it was the scariest flight he has been on. Top smilest of moments, I thought I was dead. Airline pilot here. Most of us would rather not saying anything about emergencies while in flight. However, when it comes to an air disaster occurring, almost never. Full credit to the one time I had a commercial airline pilot tell the passengers about an emergency. We were flying into Boston Logan. Then suddenly the engines rev and I feel the airplane start climbing again. I was sitting near the front, so could see the flight attendants give quick WTF glances to each other. A minute or so later the pilot came on and said, "You may have noticed that we didn't land just now. I want to assure you that there is nothing wrong with the aircraft. We didn't land because there was a truck on the runway." I so would have liked to have been listening to the radio while that happened. I am a pilot, single engine, small aircraft only. But one flight I was a passenger in. The pilots avoided telling us about a disaster until we were about to land. On a flight to Florida, one of the front wheels fell off during takeoff. Luckily, the front of the passenger aircraft had two wheels, side by side, so we weren't doomed. But no passenger knew about the problem until we were 15 minutes from landing in Florida. The pilot told us that the wheel fell off, and we had to do an emergency flyby. They had ambulances and fire trucks lining the runway, and as we landed, we pulled a really long wheelie, keeping the only remaining front tire off the ground as long as possible. Here are two pictures of the incident. I was a doctor on a flight once. Both pilots came down sick. It was just me in the cockpit with autopilot on. Somehow the stewardess found a former military pilot on board. The look on his face when he came in and saw both pilots out. "Surely you can't be serious?" I replied, "I am serious. And don't call me Shirley." This doesn't entirely fit the ARP's description, as I was still a student pilot at the time and only my instructor and myself were on board. But while I was doing a random session of instrument training, I had my blinder down. For those of you wondering, this literally means I cannot see out the windows and can only see down to my instrument panel. My instructor is giving me instructions, and I am to only rely on the instruments, which also means that he was my only eyes. So, if for any reason he saw something he didn't like, he'd say, "My plane and take control." Well, we're flying along, and he's having me perform various maneuvers with the blinders down to teach me about trusting instruments. At one point, my blinder goggles slip down my nose a smidge, and I catch a quick glance out the side window. About 40 feet off of my wing was a skydiver with parachute open. I immediately whip my goggles off and scream, "Skydivers!" And my instructor had no idea. He was my only eyes during my maneuvers, and he had me fly right into the path of skydivers without knowing it. There was a small grass strip nearby that sometimes had skydiving flights in the late summer. Thankfully he quickly yanked the yoke and flew us out of the immediate area. But it still scared me shitless. Needless to say, he was mortified afterward and kept telling me it was an accident and he seriously didn't see them. I very well could have killed someone without even knowing it. Gives me the shudders every time I think about it. Not a pilot but response. Used to fly a lot as a passenger for work, about 40 flights a year. Almost half of those across the Atlantic. Experienced a lot of rough turbulence over the years, but only two bad incidents. First one pretty boring. Pilot decided to fly into a thunderstorm near Kansas City. Saw lightning forking through the clouds right next to the plane. One annoying lady wouldn't stop screaming. Second incident. About 75-100 miles south of Greenland. Pilot made a sudden dramatic sharp right turn that tipped the contents of a drink cart on someone. To the left of the plane were two massive metallic spheres, less than a few hundred yards away. Each one about the size of an aircraft carrier. They just sat there in the air at 35,000 feet, had a really shiny sort of wet appearance. Flight attendants asked everyone to close the shutters. Everyone had seen it though, and what the ducks commenced for the next 30 minutes. That was about 8 or 9 years ago and I still wonder what the hell it was and how close we came to hitting them. I went to an aeronautical university. The majority of students were either aerospace engineers or pilots. My boyfriend is an engineer and our good friend is a pilot. Pilot friend offered to fly the three of us to a large city an hour away. We flew in, ate some Waffle House, and started flying home. My boyfriend was in front, next to the pilot, and I was in the back. We were just coming over some large mountains when the ATC lets us know the winds are crazy strong down on the flight line. Our pilot hadn't been cleared to land, so we flew in circles until we started to run low on fuel. The pilot has one of his instructors on the radio, and they decide he can land, even though he doesn't have that qualification. We prepare for landing. The wind casually bats the plane sideways. We're swaying back and forth by the struggle between wind and pilot. Finally, touchdown and land safely. I was taking a nap the whole time. After we land, my friend talked about how scared he was. I fly an older Dash 8. We have lots of little problems. Sometimes the nav system blanks out. Minor electrical issues. I fly in an area with non-precision aisles. Sometimes we only fly VFR approaches. I was landing on a small dirt stripe on Baffin Island when a crosswind pushed the aircraft off the approach and we had just enough power to go around. If the plane was a little heavier I may not be here to tell the story. I am a commercial airline captain on a newish Embraer 175. Probably one of the scarier things I have had happen was when one of our cabin pressure control channels failed and we started to rapidly lose pressurization. Pressurization is important because the air is so thin and the flight levels, specifically above 30,000 feet. The higher up you get the less time of useful consciousness you have. Down to about 30 seconds. So it is a pretty scary thought and it is a problem requiring immediate action. Usually a steep emergency descent, during which you will not hear from the pilots because we are super busy. Our pressure controller has two channels and automatically switches to the second if one fails. We were flying along about to start our descent and briefing our arrival and our ears started popping like mad. I looked over and the pressurization was climbing very fast. We started a steep, but not quite emergency descent, while I flipped the pressurization switch to manual and then back to auto. This manually switched the channel to the working one and we could continue without problem. Pretty sure all the passengers noticed with their ears popping. It gave us about 80 seconds of a scare though. The funniest part was that when we landed our maintenance control wanted us to defer the pressurization channel over the phone. Meaning we will fix it later. Generally a very safe way to get flights out on time with something minor or redundant broken. I told him I was going to have to insist that someone come over and actually look at the plane to say it was safe to fly. Edit. I would like to add that the mechanics were not being reckless. These channels rarely fail. And having two is already a redundancy. They are absolutely able to defer them with very little concern for safety. I was being overly cautious in my request for an inspection and they accommodated me without question. A few mechanics out there must have very charged relationships with pilots. This is rarely the case in my workplace.